So it is my distinct honor to introduce our next two speakers for our second session of the morning. We will begin with Meghan Towns, who's a PhD candidate in American Studies at Boston University. She is the William C. and Susan S. Mariner Ceramics Fellowship recipient this year. Meghan will be lecturing on Illuminating Alexandria, a candlestick from the Wilk Street pottery. After Meghan, we're going to have Gabrielle Clement, who is also a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Delaware. Gabrielle is the Mills Lane Architecture Fellowship recipient this year, and she will have her lecture To Protect It in Case of a Riot, Locks and Keys During the Civil War. So, Meghan?
Good morning, and I want to, of course, thank MESLA, Colonial Dames, and definitely the Mariners for their incredible support of my time here. So, it had been dark for a little more than an hour when the cannon fired its signal. In a house on Prince Street, a figure, perhaps we can imagine her as a woman, employed or enslaved by the household, begins to move from window to window lighting candles. Each candle sits in a matching candlestick, glossy gray, with deep blue bands and daubs. If the woman lifts one to bring it closer to her taper, it feels cool and heavy in her hand. At the last window, she pauses and looks beyond to where crowds slowly fill the streets with noise and light. In November 1840, William Henry Harrison and John Tyler of the Whig Party defeated Democratic incumbent Martin Van Buren in the presidential race. The Whigs had formed in the early 1830s as a coalition of political interests opposed to then-President Andrew Jackson. Yet their success had been limited on the national level. The campaign run by the party on behalf of Harrison became notable for its deployment of slogans, symbols, and enthusiastic rallies. In Alexandria, an old port city with 8,500 residents south of Washington, local supporters organized an elaborate day of events, from a morning parade to an evening illumination. Illuminations like this one in London at the beginning of the 19th century were communal celebrations featuring bonfires, candles, and lit transparent images. They appeared as part of Anglo-American popular culture in the 18th and early 19th centuries in response to elections, military victories, and other moments of jubilation, and they found renewed popularity with this Whig Party. Alexandria's Whigs, who included the mayor and many leading businessmen, therefore demonstrated their embrace of Harrison with lights. Now, ironically, since Alexandria was part of the District of Columbia since 1791, having been ceded from Virginia, these same men could not vote in the election itself. On Wilk Street in the southeastern portion of the city, the stoneware manufactory of Benedict C. Milburn advertised clay candlesticks, neatly made, safe and cheap for the Whig illumination. As everyday objects of lighting technology, candlesticks appear in newspaper advertisements throughout the mid-19th century in a variety of materials. Yet, despite the utilitarian focus of stoneware manufacturers like Milburn, candlesticks were never a common product for potters. In understanding this singular candlestick as a response to the demand created by the 1840 Whig celebrations, I suggest the need to reassess the role of lighting devices as ephemeral objects involved in political community making in the mid-19th century. By the 1840s, a standard candlestick form, a copper socket sitting atop a stem that terminated on a footed base, had existed for hundreds of years. There were shifts in style, occurring first in metal candlesticks, which, perhaps because of their association with qualities such as sturdiness and reflectivity, proved most prevalent. This is not to say that ceramic candlesticks as a category are particularly rare. From the 17th century onward in England, tin glazed earthenware versions were joined by slipware, white salt glazed stoneware, creamware, and porcelain. Extant examples and archaeological evidence indicate the importation of such wares to the United States. Yet American potteries never seem to adopt the form as a standard production item, although some earthenware candlesticks and similar oil lamps do survive. I haven't been able to locate another early American stoneware example, despite consulting with experts like Rob Hunter, Angelica Kuttner, and Luke Sipp. So if you know of one, let me know. The potters of Wilk Street created an interpretation of a molded brass or pewter stick of the period. So a rounded foot, a shoulder connecting stem and foot, substantial knops or these flaring bulges in the middle, and a flaring lip at the cup. At 6.5 inches tall, with a diameter of 4.25 inches at the base, the stoneware candlestick is scaled to the human hand, making it comfortable and secure to carry. A potential purchaser spotting the form from a distance would have known its function immediately. Now, encountering the candlestick more closely, the same purchaser would have noticed the gray body, orange peel texture, and brushed cobalt decoration that identified the item as stoneware, not dissimilar to the sturdy jars and pitchers that helped their own household function. 19th century Alexandria stoneware was wheel thrown, a process that resulted in less precise lines and shapes than those developed by metal casting. This candlestick still bears the marks of throwing, these fine parallel concentric lines, on both the exterior and interior surfaces. In one spot near the base of the cup, you can see where the potter has lifted the finger away from the piece in the process of turning, creating a diagonal slash. The cobalt decoration was also likely created at the wheel, applied in thick bands at the rim and knops, where the bands are topped with these flame-shaped marks made by quickly dropping the brush, and in a zigzag or swag-like design on the foot. These clues to the production of the candlestick tie it to Alexandria and the Wilk Street pottery. At the same time, they indicate that the circumstances of its production differed in important ways from the shop's more commonly known wares. Since 1813, a pottery had operated at the intersection of Wilkes and St. Asaph Streets. A stream crossed nearby Washington Street, offering a potential clay source, and the city's busy wharves were 5 blocks away. The original owner and potter of Wilk Street, John Swan, initially produced earthenware before transitioning to stoneware around 1815. By 1820, Swan's shop, you can kind of see a similar shop of the period here, employed at least 8 workers, including 3 enslaved men, who operated 4 wheels, 2 kilns, a warehouse, and a building for preparing clays and glazes. Now, while the quality of the wares gave the pottery a good reputation, Swan struggled financially and eventually lost ownership to Hugh Smith, a local China merchant and customer who had loaned him funds. Swan continued to work as a potter under Smith until approximately 1833, when Benedict Milburn arrived. Milburn himself first leased the pottery and then eventually bought it outright in 1841. So the characteristic decorations and forms associated with Alexandria stoneware emerged during the tenures of Swan and Milburn. The simple motifs and brushed cobalt found in Swan's early wares evolved into more elaborate swags and tassels, zigzags, chains, foliate patterns, and flowers. However, as an exceptional storage jar held by Mezza reminds us, these decorations, like the stoneware bearing them, cannot be attributed solely to the hands of Swan or Milburn. This large jar features stylized flowers on both sides, surrounded by frothy fern-like leaves. On the base, in neatly inscribed script, is 1830 Alexandria, made by D. Jarbor. David Jarbor was a free black potter who worked at Wilk Street between 1826 and 1833, and again in 1841. And during the period 1840, when the candlestick was made, we know that at least one of the potters was a black artisan named Aldred Merrick. So while wares might have been stamped with the names of Swan, Smith, and Milburn, they resulted from the work of Merrick, Jarbor, and other known and no longer known laborers and potters, free and enslaved, black and white. The most common forms produced by the Wilk Street pottery were large utilitarian vessels, such as jugs, jars, and pitchers, with some rarer types like spittoons also surviving. Candlesticks have not been documented through excavations or in museums, other than this one. And although our example bears resemblance to Alexandria wares and the clay used and has a loose stylistic affinity, it's unmarked. To further complicate matters, it really lacks the level of finish usually associated with Wilk Street wares, particularly in the presence of the throwing marks, which were normally smoothed away. But the sense of haste conveyed by these physical signs makes sense when we consider the candlestick within the context of its creation. By 1840, Alexandrians were increasingly unhappy with their economic and political situation. In February of that year, a visitor offered the following assessment. Quote, "I believe Alexandria is known as a dull city. Many there are here, even yet, who remember it as almost the Queen City of the South, as the busy, bustling, beautiful, crowded, fashionable city. Now," the visitor claimed, quote, "blades of grass have come more frequently than the passing stranger." Alexandria's decline had its roots in the interruption of trade caused by embargoes and war in the early 19th century, as well as the rise of Georgetown, a competitor port in the north. By the mid-1830s, its leaders began to frame a return to Virginia from the District of Columbia as a solution for the city's stagnation. This cause was encouraged by proposed efforts to abolish slavery in the district, which would have threatened elites' economic reliance on enslaved labor. The Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that led to bank failures and business collapses, further prompted Alexandrians to reassess their lack of representation and influence at the national level. When Congress failed to recharter the district's banks in 1840, Alexandrians termed this act a blow to their, quote, commercial community, and called on, quote, the people of our glorious native state, Virginia, to relieve us from political bondage. The Panic of 1837 also helped propel William Henry Harrison's victory, with the Whigs arguing that the Democrats had caused the Depression and now were doing nothing to alleviate it, a situation which is played on in this cartoon. The Whigs framed themselves as a party of the middle class, of sober-minded, family-oriented businessmen, and as the saviors of liberty and self-government. In southern cities like Alexandria, they capitalized on the New Yorker Van Buren's weak defense of slavery and the Virginia Rays Harrison's pro-slavery position. Alexandria's Whigs were comprised primarily of men from the city's business classes. In May of 1840, Hugh C. Smith, who had taken over his father's business interests, including the Wilk Street Pottery, served as one of the delegates for the Harrison Convention in Baltimore, commemorated by these souvenirs. So, despite their inability to vote in the presidential election, Alexandrians closely followed the results in the pages of the Alexandria Gazette, the paper of new Whig Mayor Edgar Snowden. By Monday the 9th, the paper had called the election for Harrison, and the Whigs met to begin planning a day of jubilee. That this was an event by and for the city's merchants and civic leaders is perhaps most evident in the creation of 7 committees, some with upwards of 20 members, to run the day. Hugh C. Smith himself served on the Committee of Invitation and Reception, while others included the Committee to attend to the preservation of property from damage or accident during and after the illumination, and Committee to prepare a stand and have Market Square, highlighted here, under their control during the day and night. The Whigs considered the jubilation and illumination a patriotic celebration for all their fellow citizens, but as the mention of control suggests, not everyone was welcome. Buried in the published schedule is a telling exclusion. The Market Square Committee would, quote, rigidly exclude therefrom all colored persons and preserve order during the speaking. The morning procession of dignitaries, Whig clubs, trades associations, military representatives, and young women bearing banners with state names moved in a series of narrow rectangles along the principal streets at the center of town, linking the start of Mechanics Hall to the waterfront and ending at Market Square, which is overlooked by the town hall and courthouse. While wet weather curtailed the planned speeches, the daytime events undeniably reinscribed the city's power relations onto the landscape. The night's illuminations began with the firing of a cannon sometime after 6 p.m., and this is an image of a similar illumination in Boston. A bonfire on the Potomac and another near the western limits of town symbolically brought Maryland and Virginia into the celebration, while residents moved through the city streets to the music of roving bands. In the main thoroughfares, most buildings were illuminated by transparencies and fancy lights. So transparencies were these painted or varnished paper images placed in front of light sources, and they could have political or even religious themes, like this example from Old Salem seen here. In Alexandria, we know at least what some of the transparencies depicted. The Gazette offices displayed a picture of a printing press with the motto, "The tyrant's foe, the people's friend." Transparent cider barrels and log cabins, symbols of Harrison's campaign, appeared, as did a rendering, similar to this one, of Van Buren exiting the White House as Harrison arrived. Of course, not everyone felt the illumination was successful. A Democrat writing to the Richmond Enquirer complained of, quote, "dissipation and noise of all kinds generated by groups of increasingly inebriated men and boys." Benedict Milburn first advertised clay candlesticks at $1 per 100 on November 17th, a week before the illumination. Given Hugh C. Smith's involvement in the local Whigs, he may have prompted the Wilk Street Pottery to produce objects for the event. Other local manufacturers and merchants certainly capitalized on Harrison's victory, offering small tin lamps for the illumination, log cabin letter paper, and Harrison medals, quote, "suitable for the celebration." Among the vast array of 1840 campaign souvenirs, ceramic objects constitute a small but important subfield. Excavations in Alexandria have revealed fragments of transfer-printed pitchers, plates, cups, and saucers featuring Harrison's portrait and slogans. Further afield, some stoneware manufacturers also took advantage of the election, adding Harrison or Tippecanoe onto their usual jugs and crocks, and in one case, creating a hard cider and log cabin-themed bank. So the Wilk Street Pottery's candlesticks might have lacked slogans or symbols, but they fit within this larger world of objects commemorating the election. And their manufacturer reacted to the commercial opportunity presented by the illumination, pushing the shop's potters beyond their usual wares. But why an illumination? So this is a later one in Brooklyn. During the second quarter of the 19th century, Americans across the country continued to use illuminations to celebrate a wide range of events, from the passage of a bill to celebrate the incorporation of the Charleston and Cincinnati Railroad Company to battles during the Texas Revolution and Mexican-American War. These festivities shared a common set of sensory experiences. So the heat and light coming from torches, the sight of candles flickering, the smell of tar barrels burning, and the sounds of cannon firing, bands playing, and celebrants singing and shouting slogans. Transparencies contribute to this chaos. Some advertised the work of shops whose windows they decorated, while others blazed mottos at passers-by, mourned those who had fallen in battle, and in the case of the railroad illuminations, rendered Charleston and Cincinnati as the Queen of the South and Queen of the West. Now, as the Whig Party began to spread in the 1830s, it proved particularly adept at harnessing illuminations to generate support. So a cursory newspaper keyword search for illumination indicates nearly double the results between 1830 and 1850 as compared to the 30 years preceding. The use of a celebratory practice closely linked to the period of the Founding Fathers aligned with the Whigs' ideological embrace of their values, such as independence of governmental branches and the need to check executive power. For the organizers of the Alexandria event, therefore, lighting the city represented, quote, "the moral glory which burned and blazed over the whole Union in the aftermath of Harrison's victory." The flames symbolized their joy at returning to office, someone they referred to as, quote, "the defender of his country, the supporter of liberty." In Louisville, Kentucky, Whigs framed their illumination as the, quote, "deliverance of the republic itself, a new sun spoken into existence." The political success of such events can be seen in the printed complaints of Democratic supporters who called illuminations, quote, "wrong in spirit and wasteful follies." Little remains of the ephemeral material culture associated with Whig illuminations. Transparencies were made of easily degraded materials, and designs exist for only a short while, often visually connected to a specific event. Lamps were subsumed in the daily needs of households and worn out or discarded as new lighting technologies spread. This candlestick is therefore doubly rare, first as an underrepresented product of American stoneware, and secondly as a testament to this element of 19th century political culture. So when Whigs in Alexandria lit up their city to celebrate electoral victory in 1840, they created a political community of light. The choice to place a transparency or candlestick in a window brought a household or shop within the specific boundaries of ideology, behavior, socioeconomic status. Now, unlike raucous 18th century illuminations in which a failure to participate might result in violence or property damage, the Alexandria event relied on residents to choose illumination out of a sense of belonging rather than fear. Still, the geographic parameters of the event and the control exerted by its organizers made it very clear that there were some, like our imagined woman on Prince Street, whose lighting of the candle did not equal inclusion. For those who did belong to the Whigs' definition of community, however, the purchase and display of the salt-glazed stoneware candlesticks produced by the Potters on Wilk Street was an active belief that the new presidency might bring the light of better days ahead. Thank you, and these are all the incredible people who've helped me with this project. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I'm really excited to present what I've been working on. So the title of my presentation is To Protect It in Case of a Riot, Locks and Keys in Baltimore During Civil War. On April 19, 1862, pro-secessionist and anti-war Marylanders attacked the 6th Massachusetts Regiment maneuvering through the city. Baltimore erupted into chaos. The mob attacked with makeshift weapons made from whatever they could find nearby, ranging from rocks to bottles. In this engraving, rioters are depicted unearthing the cobblestones at their feet, destroying their city in an act of military refusal. Frightened, soldiers fired into the masses in response. More shots were set off, and the Baltimore police were called to quell the violence. In the end, 12 citizens and 4 soldiers lay dead, with dozens more wounded. This urban rupture had been imminent. Just a month earlier, a conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln in Baltimore led the future president to travel undercover through the city while on his way to D.C. for his inauguration. Baltimore was a border city during the Civil War, strategically located between secessionist and Unionist states. To the south was Washington, D.C., and to the north, the Unionist stronghold of Philadelphia. Baltimore's busy harbor and nearby railroads made the city a critical transportation and commercial hub for both domestic and foreign trade. All these factors made Baltimore a particularly contentious region during the Civil War. Division, disagreement, and unbridled fear were rife. In response, officials in power demanded control and containment a necessity. This presentation will focus on a padlock and key crafted around 1840 to 1860 that entered Mesda's collection in 2000 after being on long-term loan from Frank L. Horton's personal collection. A close engagement with this object will reveal details about Baltimore's social history, the contested space of the Customs House, and the intangible sentiments of fear and insecurity that were pervasive before and during Civil War. This padlock stands out among locks of the period for multiple reasons. For one, it is a visually striking object with a pointed heart-shaped form, a large size of 5 inches long and 4 inches wide, and features of dual metals of brass and iron. While the main body of the padlock is smooth to the touch, its weight manifests objective authority. Remarkably, the padlock still has its corresponding key, which works. When unlocked, the shackle detaches completely from its body, much like a U-lock you might have for your bicycle. Turn marks worn into the brass shield indicates the lock's past use. Twisting the key to the right releases a pleasant click sound. 3 distinct marks are stamped on the padlock. Along with the maker's mark stamped C.J. Stewart across the iron shackle and above the keyhole on the brass shield, the padlock also includes a legible site mark. Placed under the abbreviation for Baltimore, Balto, on the brass shield are the words Custom House. Locks can contain multiple functions, but generally they either help keep something in or keep something out. As controllers of access, locks are related to conceptions of value, ranging from monetary to the personal. Padlocks are mobile objects that can easily be reused and repurposed. What they gatekeep and the purpose of protection can change over time. What then was the purpose of this particular padlock in Mezda's collection? What does it mean to have used this padlock? Was it locked on a gate to detract, or perhaps even an iron box to conceal? Who was C.J. Stewart, and what was the Baltimore Custom House? Part 1, the Baltimore Custom House, or also known as the Merchants Exchange Building. In order to understand the padlock's function and material context, we begin at the location affixed on its metallic body, the Baltimore Custom House. Designed in fraught collaboration between architects J. Maximilian Godefroy and Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the Custom House functioned as a multi-use commercial space. Between 1820 and 1902, the building housed the U.S. Customs Service, stockbroker offices, insurance companies, the Bank of the United States, coffee houses, meeting rooms, the post office, and even a hotel. Tracking this building's use over time has been the feat of this project, as it is a building that no longer exists in Baltimore's built environment. And in conjunction with Latrobe's infamously non-technical and inaccurate plans, this building has become particularly enigmatic. But that said, for the purposes of this presentation, I would like us to think about this structure like a shopping mall, but instead of Lululemon or Sephora, it's a 19th century hub for Baltimore's white elite merchant class. The structure contained multiple entries that could lead patrons directly from the street to their destination of choice. You could enter the Custom House on the southwest corner of Gay and Water Streets, and if you had a meeting with a business partner or wanted gossip about what was happening at the London docks you trade with, you could go straight to the coffee house. Needed to make a cash deposit at the bank after? No problem, the Bank of the United States is right there with an entrance on Gay Street. Most street entrances and internal hallways led to a large central rotunda covered by the dome. Spatially, the rotunda served as a centralized meeting place for the city's commercial and merchant elite. Every day at 1 p.m., except on Sundays, brokers met under the dome to exchange stocks, reach agreements, and conduct business. Over the building's lifetime, the Customs Service was one of the most important residents of the structure. Established in 1789, the Federal Customs Office collected tariffs and supervised the import of goods, building on a long-established British colonial system. For the first 80 years of the United States' existence, customs duties accounted for up to 80 to 95% of the total federal revenue. Customs offices were established across major ports of the United States, including the busy Baltimore port. In the 1840s and 50s, the system expanded to meet the federal government's growing need to regulate the trade of goods and the country as the country continued to grow. Enforcement expanded, and customs inspectors regularly conducted search and seizure operations on ships and in ports in an attempt to control unlawful smuggling and fraud. The seized goods were perhaps placed in locked boxes or warehouses operated by the Customs House. Stylistically, the Custom House building reflected the service's monumental presence on the Baltimore harbor. The dome of the Merchant Exchange Building communicated to a wider Baltimore public its status as a developing urban space and regulated commercial center. As seen in this 1839 print, Baltimore City view from across the harbor, two domes dominate the scene. On the left is a representation of a basilica's dome on Cathedral Hill, and on the right, the domes of the Exchange Building. For multiple reasons, including the scattering of tall minaret-like monuments and the overwhelming scale of the domes, this is not an accurate image. However, it does indicate how the domes had an impact on Baltimore's landscape. The Exchange was an iconic Baltimore structure placed on prints intended for the curio and souvenir market. Its monumental size and Greek revival features imposed an ideal of order, structure, and regulation on Baltimore's built environment. Despite the Customs House place in Baltimore and its open design plan, freedom of movement in the building was not granted to all visitors and guests. As a southern state, enslavement was a legal practice in Maryland until 1864. and Baltimore as a commercial hub for the trade of goods was a significant site for the sale, purchase, and exchange of people. In fact, 8 known auction houses participated in the sale of enslaved persons within a 2-block radius of the Merchant Exchange building, and at least one auctioneer had an office in the building. Around 1845, hotel proprietor John West refurbished the upper floors of the building to house guests. Advertisements for the Exchange Hotel were placed in newspapers from newspapers in Baltimore to Mobile, Alabama. The Exchange Hotel, the ad reads, is, quote, situated in Exchange Place, very near to the railroad depots and steamboat landings, and is peculiarly well adapted to the accommodation of families visiting Baltimore, end quote. Families, of course, were not the only groups of travelers who stayed at the hotel. The basement, initially designed by Latrobe to house insurance broker offices, likely held sales to confine enslaved persons who traveled with their enslavers who stayed at the Exchange Hotel. In an 1884 interview, when asked about the remnants of enslavement visible in Baltimore, a retired slave auctioneer, Jack Campbell, recounted, quote, "Go into any Southern hotel that was built before the war and ask them to let you go down into the cellars. See if you don't find those old cells where the servants of travelers were shut up at night. The Baltimore Custom House was once a hotel, and there are more than 24 cells under it now," end quote. This dual captivity of Bond's people is an instance in which locking was more than simply keeping in or keeping out, but of violent emotional and physical harm. Multiplicities of this building use that changed over time directly contrast the neoclassical style present through the structure's freestanding and engaged ionic columns, vaulted ceilings, and symmetrical floor plan. Although the Greek revival intended to signal stability, democratic virtue, and institutional control, in practice, this building deviated far from its aesthetic rhetoric. The presence of a padlock belonging to the Custom House by locksmith C.J. Stewart indicates insecurity, fear, and anxiety. For if he received a commission for large padlocks, there needed to be something that the iron lock protected. And while reports of theft and fraud at the custom houses in New York reached Baltimore, tensions rose as talks of secession passed through the streets and in the halls of the Maryland State House. Part 2, strife at Stewart and Sons. Born in 1808, Columbus J. Stewart spent his career working in Baltimore and its surrounding region. He began as a foundry and finishing apprentice in 1826, learning under Alexandria Hubbell of Baltimore for 4 years. Then, around 1832, Stewart joined his brother John at his bell hanging and foundry business. With his brother, Columbus refined his trade, and in 1842, he appeared in the Baltimore Directory as a locksmith at Lombard Street, east of the Friends Meeting House. Columbus J. Stewart was a highly regarded locksmith and received commissions from the likes of elite Marylanders and the U.S. government. One government commission included 573 brass locks for the U.S. Patent Office in D.C. in 1853. Stewart took pride in his work, and in 1857 and 59, he exhibited a fine display of locks for banks, prisons, stores, or residence doors at the Maryland Institute Fair. The locks for banks and vaults were described to be, quote, proof against all efforts of force, and the one of which cannot be opened with a key without a key, unless the knowledge of its construction is had, end quote. According to Stewart's obituary, he was awarded gold medal certificates from the Maryland Institute Fair for many of his submissions. The locksmith business that Stewart started to operate over 75 years ago. Let me repeat that. The locksmith business that Stewart started operated for over 75 years. After the Civil War, Stewart began a retail business selling builders' hardware with great success. The name at this time changed to C.J. Stewart and Sons. In the 1870s, Stewart's son William and later his grandson Elmer took over the business and entered a partnership with C. Crook. Hardware colleagues love the new store that opened on Liberty Street in Baltimore for its neat showcases and well-stocked shelves. There is one particular commission I would like to focus on. In 1870, the United States Department of War sent the House of Representatives a list of war expenses paid over the previous year. The record includes receipts of payment made to Baltimore-based locksmith Columbus J. Stewart for services commissioned between January and April of 1863 by James Lowry Donaldson. Services requested included the creation of 72 handcuffs, 31 ball and chains, over 722 pounds of what are likely cannon castings, and significantly for this presentation, 2 locks. Then a major in the Union Army, Donaldson was in command of the Middle Military Department as the chief quartermaster. The general's office established the Middle Department in March of 1862 to oversee all federal troops in the critical states of New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and most importantly, Maryland. And as a crucial region for the Union to control, Baltimore served as the headquarters for the Middle Department. Stewart's completed commission for the Union Army does not necessarily serve as an indicator of his political affiliations. After the Pratt Street riot, the federal government and Union Army declared rules in an attempt to control white Baltimore residents and Marylanders who held pro-Confederate sentiment. These rules also regulated the movement of enslaved persons who were fleeing northwards. Baltimore tradesmen were not allowed to make or sell goods to the Confederacy, and those who were found smuggling goods south were immediately imprisoned by the Army. In these 2 etchings here, as well as the image of medicine smuggling on the previous slide, Bavarian-born illustrator Adalbert Vrock depicts pro-Confederate Marylanders as captives and fugitives. On the left, finely dressed merchants, planters, and their servants bring the bells of their liberty to a founder casting cannons. On the right, Volk takes a cue from Lutz's famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware to sketch a narrative of Marylanders leaving the state to join the Confederate Army. For white enslavers and supporters of enslavement in Baltimore, the South represented liberation from the occupation of the Union Army's attempt to finally regulate trade, industry, and movement in the city. Before the war, Stewart earned his living as a locksmith and bell hanger, installing domestic calling bells throughout eastern Maryland. An 1842 advertisement in the Baltimore Sun lists references that include prominent planters and enslavers, such as Daniel Lloyd of White House in Talbot County, Maryland. The county's 1850 census registered that Lloyd enslaved 35 people. And this is the same Daniel Lloyd whose father, Edward Lloyd, selected 8-year-old Frederick Douglass to serve as 12-year-old Daniel's enslaved companion in 1824. In his memoir, Douglass recounts a memory of leaving Colonel Lloyd's plantation full of joy and ecstasy. Part 3, thefts, smuggling, riots, and desires for order. As I described at the very start of this presentation, the Pratt Street riot shifted the urban landscape of Baltimore. Violence unveiled the city's social divisions that had long simmered as the city and its harbor grew in importance for the region. Weeks after the Pratt Street riot, the Union Army arrived in droves. Barricades were constructed around the city to control another mob and quell the potential for more destruction of the built environment. The Custom House also transformed from a structure created for the merchant class and their possessions to barracks housing Union troops. The Custom House was strategically located with easy access to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the harbor, and proximity to the site of upheaval on Pratt Street. Additionally, as a hotel on some of its floors, the building could quarter soldiers. An engraving published in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1861 shows troops in the Custom House Central Rotunda. This is the only interior representation of the building I found so far in my research. Under the image, a caption reads, quote, "Occupation of the post office, corner of Gay and Lombard Streets, Baltimore, Maryland, by a detachment of the 20th Pennsylvania troops to protect it in case of a riot," end quote. Why was it so crucial for the Union to support the Customs House? Was there anything inside? And what happened to the Customs Service that operated in the structure during the war? In January of 1863, under the leadership of Major Donaldson, the same man who commissioned 2 padlocks from C.J. Stewart, the Union Army took control of this Customs Service. Announced in the Baltimore Sun, permits and inspections for the trade and sale of goods were regulated and overseen by the Middle Department, the 8th Army Corps of Baltimore, which occupied the Custom House building in 1863. As the announcement reads, quote, "If any officer, soldier, or sutler shall be detected in trading or making resale to citizens, he shall be immediately arrested and his case reported," end quote. Smuggled goods in fraudulent trade were not only confiscated by the Army or Customs Service, but also needed to be locked and contained to further prevent merchandise from falling into the hands of opportunistic soldiers. As evidenced through the reports and newspapers, this moment of Army occupation of the Customs Service brought together the Union, the Customs Building, and C.J. Stewart. Although I can't say for certain that the lock in Mesda's collection is the exact lock that Major Donaldson commissioned, it is very likely that the padlock witnessed the inflection point that was the Civil War in Baltimore. As an object of urban material culture, this padlock indexes assessments of value, desires for containment in the face of insecurity, and social hierarchies related to access and power. From the Custom House doors to perhaps exterior gates, iron bars of cells, or iron-locked chests holding contraband, C.J. Stewart's finely crafted padlock authorizes access not only to the people beholden of the key, but to the ones who want it bad enough. Thank you so much for being here, and this project would not have been possible without help from MESDA and Wake Forest instructors. Thank you especially to Leah Lane, Torrin Gatson, Tiffany Kozak, and Johanna Brown for your patience and expert guidance. And to my fellow fellows, it has been an absolute joy to get to work with you all, and I'm looking forward to a lifetime of collaboration. Thank you.